French commander Henri de la Tour de Vargne Vicomte Turenne began his illustrious military career in the Dutch army. His uncle, Maurice of Nassau, the stadtholder of the Netherlands, took young Henri under his wing as a volunteer in 1625. He distinguished himself in the Dutch service, gaining a reputation for bravery and martial prowess, and returned to France 5 years later. Cardinal Richelieu gave him command of a regiment, and he served for the duration of the 30 Years' War. His tactical skill and physical courage won him the rank of Marshal de Camp in 1634, and by 1640 he was considered among the best commanders in the French army. He was made a Marshal of France in 1643 for his victory at Trino. He won further victories at Breisach, Freiburg, Allerheim, and Zusmarshausen. In 1648, when civil war broke out in France, Turenne at first remained neutral. He temporarily joined the rebels, but then switched sides and fought for the king. Turenne won victories over the rebels at Blenau and Faubourg Saint-Antoine, and against their Spanish allies at Arras and Dunkirk. The royalist French victory at Dunkirk ended the civil wars and the conflict with Spain. France, after gobbling up some Spanish possessions along the eastern borders, now turned to the Dutch, whose diplomatic machinations had prevented further French gains at Spain's expense. Louis XIV sought to expand his realm and weaken the Netherlands, leading to the Franco-Dutch War. The conflict began poorly for the Dutch, but soon the Holy Roman Empire, along with Spain and Prussia, joined the war on their side. France was now at war along all of her frontiers. In this desperate situation, Turenne was placed in command of French forces in the Rhineland in April 1674. The forces given to Turenne were small compared to other armies. This may have been due to collusion among his enemies at court and in the army, particularly Secretary of State for War François Michel Letellier, the Marquis of Louvois, and Louis de Bourbon, the Great Condé, France's other great commander. It is more likely that France's military situation in the summer of 1674 only allowed for a few soldiers to be allocated to the Rhineland frontier. All in all, Turenne found himself in command of 9,000 men, facing off against much larger armies along the front. With this force, he had to defend a 200-mile frontier from Koblenz to Basel. In early June, Turenne learned that two imperial armies, one of 9,000 led by Alexander von Bournonville and Count Aeneas Silvius de Caprara, were on the move, seeking to merge their forces to cross the Rhine River. Caprara was a native of Bologna and could boast of a distinguished pedigree. His cousins, Raimondo Montecolucci and Ottavio Piccolomini, were some of the greatest soldiers of the age. The former, in fact, had fought successfully against Turenne in the campaign of the previous year, stifling his attempts to march to the aid of French forces in the Low Countries. Turenne was in no mood to wait for the enemy to strike first. He set his army on a forced march on June 12, 1674, hoping to destroy Caprara before he could link up with Bournonville. On June 14th, he crossed the Rhine on a bridge of boats near Philipsburg, and with only 3 days' worth of provisions, rushed to Hockenheim and encamped there. Meanwhile, Caprara was on the road north, marching toward Heidelberg. It is unknown when exactly he realized that Turenne was at his heels, but he must have been aware of the French presence by the time Turenne settled into camp at Hockenheim on the 14th. Turenne and Caprara's forces made contact that night, and heavy skirmishing erupted between French and Allied pickets. Fearing a surprise attack, Turenne ventured out into the dark to make certain that his troops were ready to defend the camp. On passing a tent, he heard some young recruits grumbling about the long march and poor conditions they'd endured over the past few days. He overheard an old soldier, who had been wounded in the previous hour's fighting, laying nearby. He said, "You do not know our father," referring to Turenne. "He would not have exposed us to so much fatigue if he had had not some great thing in view, of which we as yet know nothing." Turenne engaged in an incredibly dangerous operation, and he no doubt took comfort from this expression of loyalty and devotion. Caprara did not make a general attack on the night of the 14th. On the 15th, Turenne marched his tired army to Wesloch, trailing Caprara's march north. On the 16th, Turenne roused his troops for yet another march at around 3 a.m. After 4 days and 90 miles of marching, Turenne found Caprara's main army near the town of Sinsheim at 9 a.m. Caprara had chosen the ground and would make his stand. Sources differ on the number of troops engaged at Sinsheim and on their composition. Turenne had anywhere from 7,500 to 12,000 men, the majority of them cavalry. Caprara's forces were even more cavalry-heavy than Turenne's. Caprara brought 7,000 cavalry and 2,000 infantry to the field, though he might have had as many as 15,000. It is unclear where precisely in the Holy Roman Empire these soldiers were from, though many appear to have hailed from the Lorraine region. Whatever the exact figures, both forces appear to have been evenly matched in number. Caprara's decision to turn and face his pursuer has been criticized by those who insist that he should have continued on toward Heidelberg, where Bournonville was waiting. These critics forget that Caprara held several advantages going into the battle. His men were fresh and well-rested, facing an exhausted French enemy. Caprara's main advantage, however, was his position. Not only was Sinsheim itself a natural obstacle, being guarded by 2 branches of the Elsbach River, but the terrain surrounding it was elevated and perfect for defense. Caprara deployed his main force on a plateau to the north of Sinsheim, and by 9 a.m. had 1,000 foot soldiers and 400 dragoons in the town, and the fortified abbey south of the plateau. The battle began shortly after 9 a.m. Turenne's 6 cannon opened fire upon the imperial positions in Sinsheim. 1,300 French infantry and 4 squadrons of dragoons splashed across the river, using marshy fords along its length to cross. The French fought through the gardens and hedges along the riverbank and pressed on toward the town. Under heavy fire, Turenne's men, led by the Marquis of Haucourt, managed to push the imperial troops back into Sinsheim itself, where the streets were barricaded and wine barrels stuffed with dirt and beams ripped from the houses. By 10:30 a.m., after brutal fighting in the streets and outskirts of Sinsheim, the French broke through and advanced upon the fortified abbey. The abbey's defenders, in danger of being cut off from the rest of the army, put up little resistance before fleeing toward the plateau, along with their comrades who had escaped Sinsheim. 400 infantry were taken prisoner, with many more of their number killed or wounded. The French infantry in hot pursuit scrambled up the narrow defile leading to the plateau. Strangely, Caprara had failed to properly defend this position, and soon the entire French army was able to deploy on the plateau. Caprara no longer held the high ground, and the second phase of the battle began. Turenne anchored his right flank on a vineyard and his left on the steep defile his soldiers had just captured. His forces were deployed in the classic fashion of the 30 Years' War, with cavalry squadrons interspersed with infantry companies along the line. Caprara's forces were drawn up in 2 lines. The first was commanded by Charles, the Duke of Lorraine, and the second commanded by Caprara himself. Turenne attacked quickly. His infantry advancing along the edge of the ravine on his left drove their counterparts from their position anchoring the imperial right flank. The French cavalry hurled themselves against the Duke of Lorraine's line, but the right flank, commanded by General Gerber, moved too far forward and soon found itself isolated from the rest of the army. The Duke of Lorraine quickly noticed this and flung what force he could spare at Gerber, throwing his command back in disarray. The dry plateau was soon shrouded in dust as cavalry charged and countercharged. Turenne ordered a counterattack to save what was left of his right flank. Turenne, though 63 years old, led some of the cavalry charges in person. At one point, Turenne was surrounded by enemy horsemen while commanding only a few of his own squadrons. After an hour of isolation in a sea of enemies, he managed to escape back to his own lines. His charge helped stabilize the line, and the French finally began to prevail across the whole field. By 1 p.m., the imperial forces began to fall back, dismayed by the slaughter and having been weakened by the loss of so many infantry that morning. The thick forest prevented a vigorous pursuit, but the damage had been done. Caprara left 2,000 dead and wounded on the field and lost a further 600 captured while losing 40 wagons. The victorious French sacked Sinsheim. Johann Ludwig Kubel, a traveling merchant, wrote, The Frenchmen looted and burned the little town of Sinsheim, destroying the mountain road, while the fruits of the field have also been destroyed. God have mercy on the poor people. Turenne withdrew across the Rhine shortly after the battle, and Caprara joined Bournonville with what remained of his forces. Despite failing to prevent the unification of the imperial forces, Turenne had inflicted heavy losses upon them. Furthermore, one cannot dismiss the psychological impact Sinsheim had on the imperial army and on Caprara himself. Turenne had launched forth from Saverne, and within 5 days had traveled 100 miles deep into enemy territory, inflicted a crushing defeat, and then vanished back across the Rhine. The victory was hailed as a masterpiece and studied for years afterwards, particularly by Napoleon Bonaparte. As Bournonville and Caprara merged their forces, Turenne waited in Neustadt, ready to pounce once again.
Thanks for watching. If you would like to support the show, please donate at patreon.com/forgottenbattles. Please see the show notes for info.